Well, welcome everybody. When we took office 4.5 years ago, we were left a note by the Labour Party which said simply, "There's no money left." And I guess it was meant as a light-hearted parting shot. But there's nothing funny about the mismanagement of the public finances. It costs people their jobs and their homes. It meant cuts to public services. It meant businesses didn't invest. It threatened this country's economic stability and the economic security of everyone living here. The reckless was anything but a joke. Now, 4.5 years later, as we continue to sort out that mess, we hear calls to do it all over again. Spend more, borrow more, delay the cuts, deviate from the road to the stronger economy that Britain is on. I say to those who would abandon our long-term economic plan, no. The plan is working. At 5% of GDP, our deficit is down by a half. 1.75 million more people have the security of a job. 760,000 new businesses have been created. Last year, Britain was the fastest growing major advanced economy. We are on the road to a stronger economy, but we are not there yet. Don't put our recovery at risk at a time when there are so many warning lights flashing in the global economy, from the weakness in the Eurozone to the instability in Russia. It matters now more than ever that we continue to reduce our deficit and begin to reduce our debts. And that requires fiscal discipline. There's no secret formula to achieving financial security, just the hard work of controlling public spending. And what I've learnt doing this job is that making spending commitments is the easiest thing in the world. Spending commitments are superficially attractive. They get ready applause from lobby groups. They get you headlines. But unfunded spending commitments are made with borrowed money, and the price is paid by future taxpayers. Add all the spending commitments up, and you get an unaffordable bill for Britain that threatens our economy. And if you don't have an economic plan that adds up, then the small good you hope to achieve with your individual commitments is overwhelmed by the damage to public services that a failing economy brings. Now, I brought together today some of my cabinet colleagues. This is the team who've been running the departments, the team who've had to deal with the reality that there was no money left, the team who've not been able to make the easy spending promises and win the cheap applause, but have had to make the difficult decisions to save money while improving services. The team who know they're going to have to go on making these decisions because you cannot have a strong NHS or good schools or proper law and order without a strong economy. We've set out the public expenditure plan we will follow, starting with detailed, published and legislated plans for the next financial year that begins in April 2015. Those plans involve savings of £13.6 billion. What we set out today is the alternative from the Labour Party, which involves £20.7 billion of spending commitments. That is equivalent to £1,200 more borrowing for every working household. These are spending commitments made by the Labour Party since they said they were exercising iron discipline. They are commitments for the year 2015-16 alone. The sums mount up beyond that. And these commitments have been costed, many for the first time, by Treasury officials under the established opposition costing procedure. Now, my colleagues will take you through some of the individual commitments. But we're making a bigger argument today. The evidence produced today shows the Labour Party have not demonstrated the fiscal discipline or economic competence that earns an opposition the credibility to form a government. The evidence shows they are a risk to economic recovery. So the British people have a clear choice at the next election. continue on the road to a stronger economy with a competent Conservative team that have a long-term plan, or choose the chaos of over £20 billion of unfunded spending promises, higher taxes and more borrowing offered by the alternatives, which would take us back to the economic mess that Britain was in 5 years ago. Competence or chaos? That is the choice. Let's not throw it all away. Let's work through the plan. Thank you very much. William.
Thank you, George. In June 2013, Ed Miliband and Ed Balls vowed that they would exercise iron discipline when it came to controlling Labour's frontbenchers' spending proposals. No matter that this was the same iron discipline on public spending that Gordon Brown promised in his 1996 party conference speech, this time they said it would be different. Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, made a crystal clear promise on the 3rd of June 2013. He said any changes to spending plans for 2015-16 must be fully funded. In other words, he pledged that at this general election, the Labour Party would set out the tax rises or spending reductions needed to pay for any specific spending increases that they propose. Today we are publishing a document, the document in front of you, showing that Ed Miliband and Ed Balls have failed to deliver this promise. Since Ed Balls made his vow, Labour frontbenchers have promised £23.26 billion of spending increases, but only £2.52 billion of proposals to raise revenue. That means for the year 2015-16, Labour frontbenchers have made net unfunded spending commitments totalling £20.7 billion, equivalent to £1,199 more borrowing for every working household in Britain. It would mean higher taxes for hard-working people, higher mortgage rates, more debt for our children to repay. My colleagues will go through some of the detail in their own areas, but I want to highlight a couple of the examples that demonstrate Labour's lack of discipline. To take one innocuous-sounding conference pledge, Labour have committed to banning food waste from landfill, but they clearly didn't think this through. Banning food waste from landfill would cause a significant fall in landfill tax revenues. Treasury analysis shows it would cost nearly £500 million a year. Or to take another example, they announced a great fanfare, a set of GP access policies, which Andy Burnham said would cost £100 million. Treasury analysis shows it would cost over 10 times that much. And those are just two examples. There are many other commitments made, which we set out today, that are too vague to cost and therefore not included in the figures. So, in short, for all their promises, Labour have not changed. They have learnt nothing from their mistakes. I remember the 1997 election when Labour gave the appearance of discipline by making no unfunded commitments. But they've made a different choice this time. They do not even have their short-lived discipline of 1997. They are committed from the start to more wasteful spending, more borrowing, and higher taxes. It is in their DNA. And our hard-won economic security would be put at risk as a result. The Home Secretary will now run through some of the other unfunded spending to which Labour have committed themselves.
Thank you, William. Four and a half years ago, to contribute to the job of reducing the deficit and turning round the economy, we had to make difficult decisions on police spending. Labour predicted that crime would go up as a result. We acted to ensure that police spending was more efficient and effective by reforming the way the police operate. So rather than crime going up, it has fallen by over a fifth since the general election. In other words, we have ensured that we can get more for less. Yet Labour still have not learnt. Our document today shows that they have made net unfunded spending commitments of just over £1 billion for the Home Office and Ministry of Justice in 2015-16 alone. They have promised 1,000 new border staff, more youth justice spending, and cancelling decisions to make prison spending more efficient. All these plans cost money, yet Labour have no credible proposals for how to pay for them. Labour have set out some supposed savings, but they would save nowhere near what they claim. Most notably, despite Ed Balls claiming that Labour would not make any unfunded promises at this election, Labour's Shadow Policing Minister, Jack Dromey, has pledged to cancel entirely all police spending savings due in 2015-16 that we outlined in the 2013 spending round. This spending promise would cost £299 million in 2015-16, or almost £1.5 billion over the 5 years of the next Parliament. We will make savings in the policing budget in 2015-16 through reduced bureaucracy, greater collaboration and smarter procurement to get better value for money from contracts. But Labour are completely incapable of making any sensible savings. All they offer is yet more wasteful spending, more borrowing and higher taxes. They haven't changed. They haven't learnt. And that's why Ed Miliband and Ed Balls will return Britain to economic chaos. We can only have a strong, well-funded law and order policy if we have a strong economy. That's why we must continue working through our long-term economic plan. And I'll now hand over to the Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan.
Thank you, Theresa. Delivering better schools and skills for young people is a key part of our long-term economic plan to secure a better future for our country and for future generations. We need a strong economy to guarantee that every family can send their child to a good local school. That's why, as we have taken difficult decisions to reduce the deficit and turn around our economy, we have made education spending more efficient and effective by reforming our schools. We've raised standards, improved discipline, and given head teachers and parents more freedom to improve and expand their schools and to start new ones. As a result, since 2010, there are 1 million more children receiving a better education in good or outstanding schools. But Labour haven't learnt. By opposing every difficult decision we've taken to fix our economy, they have shown that they will put our school system at risk. The document we're publishing today shows that Labour have made a series of unfunded education and skills spending commitments totalling £2.9 billion in 2015-16, promises that would drive up the deficit and put our economic recovery at risk. And they have proposed absolutely no savings at all to make the education budget more efficient and effective. Let's take just one policy, Tristram Hunt's proposal to force every teacher to have qualified teacher status. Putting aside that it would force experts with years of experience in industries like engineering and computing out of our classrooms, and the fact that Tristram Hunt himself used to teach in his local secondary school without this status, this policy would cost £177 million every year, or £885 million over the next Parliament. Despite it being Labour's flagship education policy, Mr Hunt has said not a word about how he would pay for it. This illustrates how the Labour Party are simply incapable of spending discipline. Their policy of more wasteful spending, more borrowing and more debt will put our economy at risk. And that means putting the long-term future of our schools at risk too. That's because you cannot guarantee our children a good education which prepares them for life in modern Britain without a strong economy. Thank you. I'll now hand over to the Culture Secretary.
Thank you, Nicky. So there we have it. Ed Miliband and Ed Balls promised competence, but they would deliver chaos. Given their track record, this isn't surprising. These are the two people who sat at Gordon Brown's side in the Treasury when Labour began running deficits back in the year 2002. They borrowed and spent in the good years, with the IMF's own figures showing that Britain entered the financial crisis with the biggest structural deficit in the G7. After presiding over the worst recession since the war, they failed to fix the roof when the sun was shining. That meant Labour left behind the biggest budget deficit in our peacetime history. That's their track record in government. Then there's their track record in opposition. From day one, Ed Miliband and Ed Balls showed that they had learnt nothing from their mistakes. First, they denied that there needed to be any difficult decisions at all. Then, they opposed and voted against every single decision we took to reduce the deficit. Now, they claim that they won't make any unfunded spending commitments at this election. But today, we can see that they have failed to deliver on this promise. It's clear that Ed Miliband and Ed Balls have no grip whatsoever on their front bench. As a result, Labour would borrow £20.7 billion more in just their first year in government. The consequences would be disastrous. Higher mortgage rates, our children burdened with more debt. And make no mistake, Labour would put up taxes on hard-working people to pay for it. This conclusively shows that Labour haven't changed, that they haven't learnt, and that Ed Miliband is simply not up to the job. From the moment they would come into government, their inefficient spending would undo all the progress this country has worked hard to achieve. And by refusing ever to balance the overall budget or to run a surplus, Labour would run deficits, permanently adding to debt indefinitely every year forever. That means never dealing with our debts, leaving Britain unprepared for an economic crisis. The long-term future of our schools, our NHS, our public services would all be put at risk. Taxes would rise. So, at a time of global economic instability, there's a simple choice facing the British people in May. Staying on the road to a stronger economy with David Cameron's long-term economic plan, a plan that is securing a better future for Britain, for hard-working taxpayers and for our children, or Ed Miliband offering no economic plan for the future, just more of the same wasteful spending, borrowing and higher taxes that got us into this mess in the first place. In short, competence or chaos. Thank you. Now hand back to the Chancellor.
Thank you, Sajid. Right, let's take some questions. There are some friends of ours from the media here, so we will start with them. Nick Robinson in the middle of the room there.
Thank you very much, Nick Robinson, BBC News. Just taking one of the costings from this document. A huge sum, you say, almost £3.5 billion, you say it will cost Labour £3.5 billion almost, because they will reverse local authority cuts. There are 2 pages here, but there's not a single promise from Labour to reverse those local authority cuts. Can you not find a promise, or is this just a Tory assumption that they'll do something that you can then criticise? One other question. Before Christmas, at times it looked like you were focusing on an election against each other after defeat at the general election. Are your minds on winning this or on the next Tory leadership election?
Well, first of all, we're very focused on making sure that Britain's economic recovery continues. That requires a Conservative government and our long-term economic plan under the strong leadership of David Cameron. And in our party, our leader is one of our strongest assets in this general election. In the Labour Party, their leader is one of their weakest assets. Let me come very specifically to the issue raised about local authority spending cuts. You know, what we've done here is applied a reasonable test. We've said people listening to Labour spokespeople on these issues, would they think that Labour would go ahead with these cuts or not? And in the case of the local authority cuts, it is so striking, and we list in all the different ways in which Labour spokespeople have criticised every single aspect of local government expenditure cuts. So it's not like they've left big areas of it untouched and only criticised some areas of cuts to local authority budgets. They've gone through what they claim are cuts to social care, to libraries, to town centres, to all sorts of different areas of local government expenditure. And by the way, if you look at the dates of many of these things have been said in the last few weeks. Right? These aren't commitments we're dredging up from years ago. And of course, as you will know, this fill the airwaves. These are Labour spokespeople who go on programmes on the BBC and other broadcasters and say we're against the what's happening to street lighting. That's a story that happened, we'll remember from a few weeks ago. Well, the implication of that is that they would reverse those cuts. So that is why we put that number to local authority cuts. It's a good example. It's one where we haven't assumed a blanket reversal of all of our cuts in 2015-16. We've picked particular areas where they've run big, strong campaigns and continue to do so. And of course, throughout the document, there are other specific policy proposals that they have. Another question. Tom Bradley.
If your argument is that Labour spokespeople have been rather ill-disciplined over the last 5 years, you might well be right, and Ed Balls might well agree with you. But you seem to have taken every idle comment and turned it into a policy commitment. And surely that makes this document just a load of nonsense, and you well know it.
No, we have been very clear that the commitments we use are ones which are either in Labour policy documents or in party conference speeches. There are actually not many examples of sort of junior spokespeople saying things on television interviews. When they're very clear, we've included them. But the vast majority of these commitments are ones made in very large public events by the Labour Party, where clearly a lot of thought has gone into what they were talking about. Let me give you an example. The leader of the Labour Party has just spoken today. In his speech, he mentioned 3 specific Labour policies. He said that as many young people should get an apprentice as go to university. He says you should be able to see a GP within 48 hours, and there should be a 1-week wait for cancer tests. He said all that today. All 3 of them have new Treasury costings today. That is £2.3 billion of public expenditure commitments made by the Labour leader today in a speech which I didn't see in advance. We've done the thorough homework here to hear what they have been proposing, what they've put in their policy documents, what they talked about at their party conference. Today you have a very clear example. The Labour leader kicks off his election campaign with £2.3 billion of unfunded spending commitments, costed, as I say, under the established procedure by the Treasury. Another question. Gary.
Thank you very much. Gary Gibbon from Channel 4 News. Just looking at a couple of the smaller ones. I mean, again and again, page after page, you come across you saying that they're putting something to Labour, which they've never said. So just look at transport. All they've said is they want to make cycling safer. And you've come up with 63 million for that. And then on the other side, they've never said they want to cancel the cuts to the Arts Council. This is on page 44. But you've decided they do because they criticise the cuts to the Arts Council. It's not the same thing, is it? And can I just add to that a broader point? We are living at a time when voters don't trust politicians. What on earth good can it do for democracy if you're straining Labour commitments, try and make them look harder than they are, and you're borrowing Treasury officials' important time to lend false gravitas to that?
Well, again, if you look at both those examples, these are cuts that they would oppose, right? The Harriet Harman, Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, says this government is threatening the future of our arts and creative industries through slashing the Arts Council, her words, crushing the ability of local government to support culture locally and sidelining creative education. Now, what reasonable person listening to those remarks from the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party would not think that they were opposed to those cuts. Who would not think that they would reverse them, who would not think that they would put more money into the arts as a result. The same is true about the cycling commitment that you use. Again, apply a reasonableness test. You listen to these people, criticise government policy to make savings in government departments. And where the criticism is very harsh about the funding cuts, we have taken it as an assumption they would reverse them. But there are also plenty, as I say, of further additional spending commitments that they have committed to make. As I say, I think a reasonable person listening to Harriet Harman in a Labour Party press release, it was an organised piece of paper, this is not something she just said off the cuff, would take that as an assumption that the Labour Party would not proceed with our Arts Council budget.
And George, if I may just add to that, the arts sector believes that Labour will reverse cuts to the Arts Council's budget. That's what the arts sector believes. They've said it to me time and time again, and they believe it because Labour has said it so often, not just Harriet Harman, but a number of other Labour spokesmen. And so there is a reasonable test applied to this. Now, if Labour thinks that we're wrong in asserting this, then it's up to them to come out today and they can say, we will not reverse those cuts.
Very good question. Let's take Francis Elliott standing there.
Hi, Francis Elliott from The Times. The biggest spending commitment that you say on this list is increasing borrowing powers for the Green Investment Bank at almost $4 billion. You outlined two scenarios, one in which they deploy the full powers over 1 year and another over 2 years. Why not 5 years? Why not 10 years? I mean, again, it looks like you've just plucked some assumptions and gone for one that's appalling and one that's slightly less appalling. And so the second question is, given that this is an election where trust is at such a premium, why not allow the OBR to audit them all and we can have a proper grown-up debate instead of this?
Well, let's take the Green Investment Bank as a very good example. Again, this is something that the Labour Party has repeatedly promised as a commitment. It's been amongst their major pledges for the election. We've taken the assumption that when Ed Balls talks about borrowing several billion pounds, and the Shadow Environment Secretary talks about that, leveraging in billions of pounds. We made an assumption that would happen over a period of years. We've not assumed this would all happen in year one, but I think it's a perfectly reasonable assumption that if this took place over 3 or 4 years, that you'd have around 3 billion, £3.5 billion pounds in the first year. Again, this is something they go around telling, all sorts of Economist Energy Conference 2014, interviews in the New Statesman about the infrastructure they'd invest. So, as I say, as Sajid was just saying as well, it's up to the Labour Party to put to the British people a costed programme. At the moment, what they're doing is making a series of uncosted commitments that, if you add them up together, amount to a threat to Britain's economic stability. And in the end, I think there's a bigger question about, or a bigger picture about this general election. You have at the moment the Labour Party kicking off the year, complaining about Conservative spending plans. That's what the speech that the Labour leader gave today. They can't have it both ways. They can't, on the one hand, complain that our spending plans are too tough, and on the other hand, pretend that they wouldn't spend, borrow and tax more. It doesn't add up as a political message from the Labour Party. More importantly, it doesn't add up as an economic policy. And if you pursue a policy of making all sorts of billions of pounds of spending commitments, increasing taxes, increasing borrowing, then I think you would take Britain back to square one, to the economic chaos it was in 5 years ago when this government came to office. Who's got another question? Tom Newton-Dunn.
Tom Newton-Dunn from The Sun. Chancellor, if unfunded spending is foolish, in your own words just now, will you spell out exactly how you plan to pay for £7.2 billion of tax cuts before this general election? Because you haven't done that yet.
Well, we have set out the spending totals, and they are subject to debate at the moment in this election, that would deliver, by the end of this decade, a surplus of over £20 billion. We made a commitment that by 2020 we would have achieved an increase in the personal allowance to £12,500. We'd have raised the high rate threshold to £50,000. I think you can see from our spending totals that this is perfectly achievable. You can also see from our record in this Parliament where we've achieved a £9 billion reduction in income tax whilst bringing the deficit down and taking difficult spending decisions. And what we're committing to doing in the next Parliament is to continue the current pace of deficit reduction. Those tax reductions are a key part of our long-term economic plan. They're about incentivising work, making sure that work pays, making sure that people in this country keep more of their own hard-earned income. It is not additional to our long-term economic plan. The spending proposals we have, the tax proposals we have, the proposals to improve education and skills and the like are all integral to our long-term economic plan to continue the British economic recovery. Andy.
Thanks very much. Andy Bale, Channel 5 News. You didn't answer Francis Elliott's question, so I'm going to ask it again. Why not allow the Office of Budget Responsibility to audit all the programmes of the major parties so that the public can have much more confidence in the figures that are being bandied about?
Well, first of all, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is worth remembering, was an organisation that we created that was opposed by the Labour Party. And I remember a Shadow Chancellor regularly proposing it in Parliament and moving motions to create one, and they opposed it repeatedly over the years. But I'm glad that it has got now broad political support, and there seems to be a consensus around its existence and continued existence, and I think it does an excellent job. They conducted their own independent review last year of the OBR and how it had functioned over the first few years of its life. They got an external reviewer in, someone not from the United Kingdom but from Canada, and their conclusion was that it was not right now to move the OBR into this space of costing opposition proposals or proposals from all different political parties. It's something we've committed to look at in the new Parliament, something we can consider going forward. But their own independent review said it was not something they felt was right at this time, and that's the advice we followed. Who's got another question? Chris.
Today is an unusual day, seeing so many senior Tory cabinet ministers together. We've been briefed it shows the party has strength and depth behind David Cameron. Someone said today it looks a bit like a leadership hustings. Please can each one of you say, individually, why you might make a good leader of the Tory party one day?
But Chris, we're not going to do that, because this is a team. This is a team united behind David Cameron, a strong Prime Minister who will lead our country in the coming years to an even stronger economic recovery. And what we demonstrate today is that there is a team working in government on that long-term economic plan across different departments, but all with one goal in mind, which is to deliver a brighter future for this country, to secure the economic recovery, to stop Britain going back to the mess it was in 5 years ago. Right. Let's take one question here. Gentleman, and then maybe...
Michael Settle from the Herald. A reasonable question to Mr Hague. The best ally that Scottish nationalism has is English nationalism. Isn't your plan for evil just a cynical political ploy to grab votes from England at the next general election? And a quick question to Mr Osborne. It's quite clear from your launch today that you're going to base your campaign on the politics of fear. And doesn't the British electorate deserve more than that?
Well, I'll deal with that very quickly. And then we began the campaign talking about staying on the road to a stronger economy. We're fighting a positive campaign, but we're also highlighting the risks to that economic recovery from the alternatives, and that's a perfectly fair thing to do in a general election. As I say, we started with a positive campaign and a positive poster. I can't help but note the Labour Party had a negative poster, but that's for them to answer to. William.
On the question about Scotland and England, it's important to recognise that constitutional change affects all parts of the United Kingdom. We are honouring the commitments made in the referendum to Scotland, and indeed, as you know, we're committed to publish by Burns Night later this month the draft clauses, the draft legislation, honouring the commitments made in the referendum. And those commitments are not conditional on anything else. But it is important to be fair to everyone in the United Kingdom and to all parts of the United Kingdom. And therefore we do, in addition to giving more powers to the Scottish Parliament, more powers to the Welsh Assembly that we're working on as well, and indeed more devolved powers to Northern Ireland in the light of the recent agreement. The Northern Ireland Secretary will make statements about this week. In addition to those things, we do have to make sure that we're fair to the voters and the people of England. And that means that when policies are implemented that have a separate and distinct effect on England, then it is only right and democratic that the consent of the representatives of the English voters should be determined. And that is what we're arguing here. That is part of keeping the United Kingdom together. It's part of all being able to work fairly together in the future. So I don't think that in any way has contributed to Scottish nationalism, and indeed I don't think there's a strong feeling in Scotland that we should be anything other than fair to the people of England as well.
Right. Let's take our final... Is that Joe Murphy at the back there? Let's take that as the final question.
£21 billion is a very big number until you compare it with your own record. The 2010 Red Book predicted £37 billion deficit in the current financial year. It's some 50 billion more than that. Is that really a dividing line between chaos and competence, as you say?
I think what you have here is not only a set of specific spending commitments that would add to public expenditure, add to public borrowing, lead to higher taxes, but also you have, if you like, a snapshot of what the Labour Party are offering this country, which is chaos, ill discipline, lack of fiscal control. This is, of course, when they've been trying to pretend they wouldn't necessarily spend more money. And I think they've been exposed today. And that, in the end, is the choice facing this country. We either have a competent Conservative team delivering a long-term economic plan that is keeping us on the road to economic recovery, or we have the chaos of unfunded spending commitments, extra borrowing, extra taxes that all the others offer. And that's the choice, therefore, chaos or competence. And with the Conservative team, you get economic competence. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.